Okay. I wanted to put together a little video presentation on our first class session in the event that we are unable to meet due to technical issues. Okay. So when we start to talk about global strategic management, it has an awful lot to do with strategy. It has an awful lot to do with competitive advantage and so forth. So we're going to start with the basic premise that has been put out in a couple of different ways. But basically, it's the idea that if you don't know where you're going, anyone can get you there, obviously. And management's job is not to see the company as it is, but where it can be and what it can do down the road. So, in terms of some kind of a roadmap, we're going to talk a little bit about the process of crafting and executing strategy, developing the idea of a strategic vision, and in fact, trying to create one. And we'll put some meat on the bones a bit later in the semester on that, and the different phases associated with strategy making. So basically, the process is obviously developing a strategic vision, setting objectives, crafting a strategy to achieve all of that stuff. And then the tough part, of course, is the idea of implementation. It's one thing to be able to sit around a table and argue over, well, what we should do and what we shouldn't do, and what the firm can be and what it can't be, and what the market's doing and what the environmental issues are at the moment, meaning political, regulatory, uh, technological, economic, and so forth. That's the easy part, which is not the same thing as saying it's easy, but that's the easy part. The tougher part, of course, is the implementation. And then what we turn to is what we would talk about in more of a tech setting is the idea of a feedback loop. Because once we implement the idea of strategy or competitive advantage or something similar, then we want to constantly monitor that and make adjustments as we go along the way. So, in terms of developing a strategic vision, phase one of the process involves thinking strategically. And strategically, we simply mean big picture. It's the strategic level of 10,000-foot view versus the tactical level. So, as an example, when we talk strategically, allow me a sip of coffee. When we talk strategically, talking about big picture stuff, we're talking about the idea of, for example, years ago, Amazon and others. Walmart was a great example. Implemented the idea of revamping their total, uh, EDI system, electronic data transfer. And that had to do with inventory. It had to do with positioning, et cetera, et cetera. The small end or tactical end would be, well, what are the monitors look like, and what kind of uh, computers on a localized basis, are we going to use, and so forth. So, in terms of strategic vision, it's the big picture stuff. It's not the minutia. So we talk about things like the future direction of the company. If you think back to Amazon, Amazon was basically a book reseller, years ago, and this is 20, 30 years ago. I used to take books from the university, that I would use in a semester. And when the semester was over, I would post them to Amazon and someone would buy them and so forth. So there was a little bit of business done there. Well, Amazon has obviously evolved into something well beyond just being a book reseller. So the future direction of the company, not what they are today, what can they be going forward? So changes in the company's product, market, customer, and the technology implementation piece to improve things like market position, future growth of the firm and future prospects, go global, don't go global, and then, of course, how to get there. I'm not going to read this slide to you, but when we talk about external considerations and internal considerations, sometimes we get somebody that says, well, we have to think strategically about this. We're going to do a SWOT analysis. Well, in my view, when somebody says that, alarm bells ought to go off, because SWOT, while it can be used as a strategic, in quotes, model, SWOT is really a tactical level model. Think about it. The internals are strengths and weaknesses, and then the externals are opportunities and threats. Okay. Well, how do we typically apply SWOT? Well, what are the strengths and weaknesses? Well, we just got new computers on everybody's desks. We just, got the building redone and the lobby redone and the offices. So we're doing very tactical level things instead of looking at big picture stuff. And we would do the same things in opportunities and threats. There's a model called SAP ETOP, Strategic Advantage Profile, Environmental Threats and Opportunities Profile. So it's similar because the SAP side, Strategic Advantage Profile, that's the internals to the firm, strategic advantage, and it addresses some of the questions. What are we good at, et cetera, et cetera. The ETOP side, Environmental Threats and Opportunities Profile, well, that's the externals. That's the environmental stuff. And by environmental, I don't just mean bug and butterfly kind of environment stuff, air, water, et cetera. We're talking about political, legal, regulatory, technological, cultural, social, economic, and so forth. So when we consider these things, we really ought to be looking, in my view, at the perspective of SAP ETOP, the internals or the strategic advantage profile elements of the firm, and the externals or the environmental threats and so forth to the firm, but based on some of the elements that I just indicated. So SAP ETOP, internals, externals, cultural, R&D, HRM, the risk profile of the firm, those are internals to the firm. Externals are things like economic environment, political environment, regulatory environment, technological, and so forth. So what are some of the key elements of a strategic vision? Well, kind of management's aspirations for the business. Where are we going? And it steers the efforts, hopefully in kind of a congruent fashion, of the employees toward a common end. It creates organizational identity, and hopefully this is a distinctive of the firm and very specific to the organization, and it forces us to avoid the use of ambiguity. Characteristics of an effectively worded vision statement, and I'm not going to read this to you, but this is something you should review because it is certainly all of these things. Basically, a well-stated vision statement gives direction to everyone, the shareholders, all of the stakeholders, shareholders, the employees, the clients or customers, and so forth. So it's imperative to have an effectively worded vision statement. And some of the shortcomings typically involve these. Excuse me. Incomplete, so very arbitrary and ambiguous, short on specifics. The real lofty stuff that really is so abstract it could mean almost anything. Vague doesn't really provide much indication of whether or how management intends to alter from where we are to where we want to be. Bland, you couldn't motivate a frog to jump. Not distinctive, too reliant on superlatives, because if you think about it, and this is what we do oftentimes in class, create a vision statement for a firm. So we say, well, we want to be the best we can be at, whatever that, stop, come on. Those superlatives, probably work on a very basic level. But in terms of what we sometimes refer to, and I hate the cliche, but the real world, we have to actually define this stuff and we have to get specific about this stuff. And certainly by the time we get to implementation, we're forced to do all of that. But the other thing, things like being too generic, so in other words, it could be anybody or anything or any firm, and so broad that it really doesn't rule out, or for that matter, rule in anything in particular. So we've got to be a little bit specific. When we look at SpaceX, for example, company vision to make humanity multi-planet planetary, but some of the specifics primarily by establishing a self-sustaining city on, well, that's pretty damn specific. This is Elon, and love him or hate him. This is Elon saying, look, this is what we want to do. Now you don't see, well, we want to be the best space company on the planet with aspirations of going, stop it. He's saying, look, this is what we want to do. This is who we are, to make humanity multiplanetary. All right, we want to go someplace beyond, you know, Earth, someplace beyond lower lunar orbit. And doing that exactly how? Well, primarily by establishing a self-sustaining city on Mars. And then to succeed, we must, and then he goes on with some more arguably specifics, but build a self-sufficient Martian city. Well, that's pretty direct. There's not much abstraction there. And we get a little bit here by performing at world-class levels. So world-class, what does that mean? That's a bit abstract, but funded by our launch services and Starlink. Well, that's pretty on point. Some other examples: Amazon to be Earth's most customer-centric company. Okay, focusing on unparalleled selection, low prices, and convenience, and so on and so forth. All right, probably not as detailed and specific as Elon, but Jeff Bezos can afford to be, whatever he wants to be. That's not the worst one I've seen. Wells Fargo. We want to satisfy all of our customers' financial needs, help them succeed financially, be the premier provider of financial services. And given the nature of financial services, that's probably not too abstract also, because again, we make some assumptions, and some of the assumptions, I think, with financial services: can I do my banking there? Can I get involved with things like annuities and the stock market and bond markets and so, and Wells Fargo, one vehicle or another, provides all of that stuff. So they can afford to be a little bit abstract with that. Strategic vision versus mission. Well, strategic vision is the firm's future business. In other words, where are we going? If you look at the mission statement, it's mostly focused on the current business, who we are and what we do. And you can read some of the bullet points and so forth, but that's probably the key distinctive. Typically, characteristics of a mission statement, well, it defines, again, the current business activities. In other words, present products and services, the types of customers that are served, and it conveys, in a very real sense, who we are, what we do, and why we're here. Key elements, well, three factors to consider: customer needs, customer groups, and then the idea of how customers' needs are satisfied. So, what are the technologies and the resources and the approaches we'll use to do all of this seemingly great stuff. McDonald's is interesting, and we can argue whether they've changed over time, but McDonald's mission statement: plan to win strategy. Okay, that's a bit abstract. I'm not entirely sure what that means, other than, make money, but to make delicious, feel-good moments easy for everyone. We focus on serving quality food with convenience, affordability, speed, blah, blah, blah stuff. Now, I have to tell you, McDonald's has been a global brand, I don't know, forever, starting certainly in my lifetime, the 50s and 60s and going forward, and recognized everywhere, the golden arches. But I got to tell you, the other day, I was with my son. We went into McDonald's locally, and I ordered a Big Mac. I've been eating Big Macs since I was, your age and probably before. Back in the day, the jingle was two all beef patties, special sauce, lettuce, cheese, pickles, onions on a sesame seed bun. Bun was there, special sauce was there, lettuce, cheese, pickles. I have never, I have never seen two thinner, I'm going to call them patties because I guess that's what they, are commonly referred to as. But I have never seen two thinner patties. They were, if each of them was an eighth of an inch thick, not a quarter of an inch. If it was an eighth of an inch thick, I think I'm being generous. I don't know what McDonald's is trying to do, if they're deliberately trying to go out of business. Maybe they've been purchased wholesale by private equity, and there's those in finance know what that is. But at the end of the day, private equity basically destroys the firm while capturing all the profit, the money, let's put it that way. And I've never seen such thin patties. I will never, after all these years, ever, ever, ever go back to a McDonald's again. Okay, linking the vision with company values. Well, a statement of values is often provided to guide the company's pursuit of its vision. Okay, well, so what are values? Well, values are basically the beliefs and the hardcore stuff. You look at a Chick-fil-A, for example. Now, right or wrong, good or bad, I don't know if they still do it, but they used to close on Sunday because they were very, and these aren't my words, but they're a very Christian organization. What I mean, and so they believe that, well, Sunday is the Lord's day, so we don't do business on Sunday. Other people believe differently. Whatever helps you sleep nights. I'm not advocating anything other than just articulating some of the information that's generally available and out there. So, okay, a company is entitled to have its own belief structure and operate the way it chooses to operate. It impacts, obviously, companies' different operations and worldviews on things, and certainly the behavior of the workforce. Now, I will say my view, you believe whatever you believe. My view, Chick-fil-A probably make as good, if not a better, if not the best chicken sandwich that I've come across recently. And at least the one that I frequently go to, which is up in the Ramsey Mawa area on Route 17. These are the friendliest, kindest, most professional staff uh, that I've come across. They just couldn't be nicer. The product is great. The place is spotlessly clean. So, whatever the company believes, I mean, it translates, at least translates to somebody like me. Typically, value statements contain, per the textbook at least, between 4 and 8 values, and they're ideally tightly connected to and reinforce the company's vision, strategy, and operating practices. So, some examples: Home Depot. Okay, an entrepreneurial spirit. Well, I don't know how to assess that. Excellent customer service. Well, maybe at one time. I find greater success at Lowe's, at least with the Home Depots in my area. I think you got a bunch of bums running the couple that I happen to visit as a proximity. Giving back to the community, I don't know that they do or don't. Respect for all people, I would say probably not. Doing the right thing, that's so abstract, I have no idea what that means. Taking care of people, well, I suppose everybody's in it for their own self-interest, so maybe that's what that means. Building strong relationships. Well, certainly not with me. Creating shareholder value. Well, I have to give them an A or a star on that one because over the years, Home Depot stock has grown and split and grown and split and grown and split. So they're certainly doing that. So as far as the rest of it, this is where we get into some of that stuff. This stuff is a bit abstract, you know, entrepreneurial spirit. Well, what does that mean? Excellent customer service. Well, that's again using superlatives. That's a bit abstract. Excellent customer service. What does that mean? You only piss off 1 out of 10 clients instead of 5 out of 10. What are the metrics for that? Giving back to the community. I'm a little puzzled about that. What does that mean? They allow the Salvation Army to ring the bell outside their stores, around Christmas time or something like that. You get the idea. It's a little bit wishy-washy, a little bit abstract, so I'm not sure what all of that means. Communicating the strategic vision, well, an exciting and inspirational vision can motivate people, motivate the workforce, motivate the client force, client base, and so forth. And what are some of the elements? Well, it contains memorable language, clearly maps out the company's future direction, challenges and motivates the workforce, blah, blah, blah. Okay. Winning support for the vision involves putting where we are going and why in writing. In other words, get the specifics out there and then distribute the statement organization wide. We don't always do. Overcoming resistance to a new strategic vision. Well, mobilizing support for the new vision entails reiterating the basis for the decision. Nothing like good communication. Addressing employees' concerns head on, no baloney. Because sometimes we have these big meetings and we get together and employees, well, is that going to mean greater hours? And then we get some kind of baloney answer. Oh, we're trying to respond to client needs, so we are a customer-focused organization. In other words, anything that the customer wants, we want to be able. What hogwash? So, in other words, is that a yes or a no? Calming fears. Likely as trust is always a factor. So, calming fears comes with an organization where both clients and the different stakeholder groups actually have some kind of belief in what is being communicated. What's the expression? Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. So trust is a huge factor. Lie once, get caught in a lie once, sling enough baloney once, and that's the end of that credibility. Lifting spirits. Well, probably wouldn't need to lift spirits in a trusted environment with no negative impacts. So, I'll take a mulligan on that one. Providing updates and progress, absolutely essential. Even recently in the whole M&A activity that involved the universities, um, one thing I will say is that to a great extent, maybe not 100%, but to a great extent, uh, the different administrations were very good at providing updates and progress. Some of it was a little abstract. Some of it was a little bit obtuse. And so, we would kind of leave scratching our heads saying, well, what exactly was said there? But the attempt was made to try and provide openness and transparency, which is kind of key. Strategic inflection points. Well, so strategic inflection points. There are times when companies come to a major fork in the road, sometimes driven by market conditions. Some are changing rapidly in ways that threaten or endanger the company's business. And what might that be? Well, recently we suffered from, higher interest rates. And, when the cost of money, which is an interest rate to be concerned with, when the cost of money gets higher, people buy less. Firms can't afford to inventory as much. Firms cannot always afford to raise prices and pass them along because sometimes there's just not that kind of price elasticity, which we learned about in macroeconomics. So market conditions are a big factor. Tariffs. are a recent development, and whether they're good or bad or right or wrong is subject to debate. But tariffs reflect an additional cost sometimes on things that you and I might purchase. So that creates a certain negativity, a slowdown oftentimes in market purchasing. We'll call it the demand curve, but the demand for goods and services as prices go up, declines a bit. So there are inflection points where decisions have to be made. Sometimes it's simply because the strategy runs out of steam. Whatever was a great idea 10 years ago when we started is just no longer applicable. Uh, and a lot of times because of the actions of the so-called C-suite, the C-suite, CEO, CFO, COO, Chief Executive Officer, Chief Financial Officer, Chief Operating Officer. So the C-suite sometimes allows competitors to block the success of the company's present strategic course and strategy. In other words, they're asleep at the switch. Well, that can cause, to put it mildly, a split or fork in the road. And critical decisions have to be made about where to go from any of those points. Oftentimes, some of those things lead to either an M&A, some sort, a merger or acquisition of some sort, or, in an extremely hostile environment, bankruptcy. All right, we'll do a couple more slides and then I'll break this into a second part. But payoffs of a clear strategic vision, well, it crystallizes an organization's long-term direction. So nobody's confused about where we're going and how we hope to get there. It reduces the risk of the so-called rudderless decision-making and assists in gaining support of stakeholders, this buy-in. And, we used to talk about that. There was a word that came out probably 10 years ago, maybe it was 15 years ago now, called intrapreneurship. And basically, it was saying that, look, employees of a large firm, we want them to act like entrepreneurs. In other words, we want them to buy in and we want them to feel this ownership responsibility and so forth. And that's great if you can get it, but that's easier said than done. But sometimes, uh, you know, we look at this vision, we implement this vision, and if it's on point and intact and believable, we can get this buy-in from employees, along with the corporate culture, along with how we treat our different stakeholders, including employees and so forth. It helps keep strategy related actions of managers on a common path and helps the organization prepare for the future. All right, I'm going to break here because we'll get into phase 2 shortly of the strategy making process. But I'm going to stop here and we will resume in part 2 of this shortly.